evening. Tonight, the Prime Minister under pressure as leadership speculation swirls. The internal polling, which could spell disaster for Albanese. Also tonight, a neo-Nazi unmasked. The anonymous tradie revealed as swastika-waving extremist. His extraordinary double life will shock you. And environmentalists victim shame a woman mauled by a shark in Sydney Harbour. I'll speak with an expert who's been warning of this problem for years. But first tonight, it's now game on ahead of the next election. Anthony Albanese is fending off a fierce coalition campaign that claims Labor has plans to tax the family home and scrap negative gearing. This in the wake of Albanese's legacy-defining broken promise on Stage 3 tax cuts. I can reveal that Liberal attack ads are going out shortly in the seat of Dunkley on Albanese's broken promise and his wrong priorities. Peter Dutton is now ramping up his assault on the Prime Minister. He's energised after Liberal polling shows the coalition has a shot in the Dunkley by-election.
So I think the Prime Minister, after having promised it on 100 occasions, we now need to test his credibility in relation to negative gearing and tax on the family home, because the Prime Minister, interestingly, and if you look at the Treasurer's words in relation to the question he was asked about negative gearing, he uses a very cute form of words, as the Prime Minister did in Parliament, which I think gives rise to more questions than answers. I think there is a lot to play out in relation to this debate, and I think Australians have been staggered by the fact that their Prime Minister looked them in the eye and bluntly lied to them.
Well, Liberal polling leaked to the Fin Review shows that Albanese was going to struggle to hold on to the seat of Dunkley, with his net favourability rating tanking to minus 11%. This prompted Albanese to rush forward the Stage 3 tax cuts revamp, as we revealed here exclusively on Thursday night. But now this broken promise risks destroying Albanese's credibility with the broader Australian public. Dutton's attack today came after the Treasurer said that Labor wasn't contemplating changes to negative gearing, a similar form of words used before the Stage 3 tax cut broken promise.
We're not contemplating or considering resurrecting the policies that we took to the 2019 election.
Are you prepared to break other promises if there are better ways, or is this one and done?
We're not contemplating other areas.
Coalition sources say that just like with the Stage 3 tax cuts, the Labor leadership have never liked negative gearing. They point to how Jim Chalmers argued strongly against negative gearing when in opposition.
But any housing policy that doesn't deal with negative gearing and capital gains tax is a sham. Housing affordability, which doesn't make important and considered changes to capital gains and negative gearing, has a hole in the middle of it. If you want to deal with housing affordability, you need to start with negative gearing and capital gains.
Those comments were in 2017, before the 2019 election, when Labor's official policy was to change negative gearing. The Fin Review today reports that Liberal polling shows that while Labor was still ahead in Dunkley, the gap had narrowed to the extent that the coalition was in a competitive position. Labor former Queensland State Secretary Cameron Milner said on this program last night that Dunkley was a key reason the Prime Minister rushed forward changes to the tax policy, with their revamped package helping around 87% of voters in that seat.
We knew by the time he broke his promise last week that they'd been planning this since December, and December was regrettably when Peter Murphy passed away. So we knew a by-election was coming in Dunkley. We knew that Dunkley was going to be a highly contestable seat given Albanese's current lack of popularity in the electorate. So it's a huge issue. He panicked, Labor panicked, and brought forward what they're probably always going to do in terms of the May budget, in terms of gutting Stage 3 tax cuts.
Make no mistake, this contest in the seat of Dunkley is shaping up as a major test for the Prime Minister. If Albanese can't win Dunkley, he'll come under significant leadership pressure. There are around 15 or 16 Labor seats with margins of less than 6%, Dunkley's on around 6.3%. So there's a lot of politicians who are nervously watching how the party will go in this Victorian suburban seat. And already Labor MPs are speculating about who the next leader will be, with Jim Chalmers, Tanya Plibersek and Tony Burke the top candidates. If Albanese can't win Dunkley, if he can't turn around voter sentiment, his time in the top job is ticking. Joining me now, Sky News host James Morrow and Liberal power broker Michael Kroger. Welcome to you both. Great to see you. Now, James, I've learned that this polling that shows Labor would struggle in Dunkley, it was reported in the Fin today, but I've discovered that it was done in January. It was just before Albanese made his announcement on the tax cuts. What it showed is that the Liberals really do have a shot in Dunkley. The question now is whether Albanese's revamped tax plan will help Labor's chances in Dunkley, because it does help around 87% of voters, or whether it's actually going to ironically damage him, because ultimately it's a breach of faith with the electorate.
Well, that's a really interesting question, because you've got to put a few different things on this timeline here, right? You've got Dunkley coming up, and what an awful lot of people in the Liberals were saying to me before this and just after the stage 3 blow-up happened was that, they were looking at the tea leaves in Dunkley. They were saying, oh, we need to do something to reset this here. It's not looking good for us. They really want to win that, want it bad. So on that level, they've reset things, and it may actually, I think, give them a hit temporarily in Dunkley. And I think it will actually, despite that other poll, give the government a bit of a sugar hit just around this sort of idea that people are kind of cross about a lot of things with the economy. But where it's going to hurt them is down the road in two different ways. Number one, they've got this whole problem that when the tax cuts finally do show up, they're going to be measly. So no one's going to, feel them. It's a few bucks a week for a lot of people. It's not really this big, sacks of money sort of thing that some of the cartoonists and stuff portrayed it as being. And number two, of course, that's where the trust issue comes in, because they've drawn from their capital of trust to do this big change. And as a result, having, achieved a sugar hit for Dunkley and given people a couple of bucks, and I mean sometimes really just a couple of bucks back, they've lost that capital. And then it's going to be on to the next thing. It's going to be on to negative gearing or some other thing, which is going to do the same cycle again, rinse and repeat.
Yeah, it absolutely opens the way for a scare campaign on any number of tax topics. I mean, Michael, you're one of the most experienced political operatives and observers. Do you think voters are going to be grateful for this extra $18 a week, or are they going to hold the broken promise against Albanese?
Both. They'll take the money and hold it against him. They're basically going to say any money we can get from the government during an economic crisis and a cost of living crisis, we're happy to take. But Sharri, they're going to say to themselves, having got the money, this bloke cannot be trusted. And those, quite frankly, those devastating clips you've just shown of Jim Chalmers and what he says, as opposed to that sort of fake interview he gave the other day, the press conference he gave the other way. Everybody knows that in their heart, Labor wants to, change negative gearing laws so that people can't negatively gear investment properties. Everyone knows that Labor doesn't agree with a capital gains tax discount that people get for risking capital as opposed to income. Labor doesn't agree with that. Everyone knows that Labor don't agree with how franking credits operate so that pensioners get a refund on some tax they may not have paid. Everyone knows they want to tax super funds high, which they already have. And everyone knows in their heart that most of the Labor Party would like to tax capital gains on the sale of the family home. So they will take the money and they will hold it against him, Sharri.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, James, that, politicians, and Albanese in particular, he gets so frustrated when journalists say to him at press conferences, can you rule out changes on taxing the family home? Can you rule out changes to inheritance taxes? Because we know that in his younger years, Anthony Albanese argued strongly for death taxes. This is some 2 decades ago. And he gets so angry and frustrated at this. But the reason journalists ask these questions is because Labor has previously argued for these points, and because they have changed, they have broken promises already, superannuation, franking credits, and now stage 3 tax cuts.
Well, I mean, it's not just all of that, Sharri. Think about, all the times we saw on The Voice when he would get all snippy and angry over suggestions that The Voice could do things like change Australia or recommended change to Australia. And he'd get furious about it, even though everyone said, they could because that's the sort of thing that body would want to do. And at the same time, look at his record on Israel. Again, here we are. But just on the question of what we're talking about here tonight with the economy, and what I think Michael has correctly said are all the things that's really encoded in Labor's DNA around franking credits, negative gearing, the family home, and so on and so forth. What this comes down to is, a series of moves that they'll pitch up as reform, but are actually anti-reform and are complete attacks on aspiration, and they're generational attacks too. I think an awful lot of advisors in the Albanese camp and in his office spend far too much time looking at Twitter and, listening to some of the people on there who believe they've got this whole generational warfare thing and NIMBYs versus YIMBYs that they're trying to run. And, that ain't the real world, Sharri. The real world is people who are out there, they've saved, they've invested, they've provided for their retirement, as another great Labor Prime Minister, Paul Keating, wanted them to do. And here we are with them trying to unwind all of that reform for the old, Sydney University 1970s class warfare nonsense that Anthony Albanese grew up in.
Look, it's going to be a fascinating fight. Now, look, I want to ask you about this other big story on the front page of the paper today. Military commanders are warning that our troops are at risk because the Australian Army has no unmanned drones. Ben Packerman reports that even Yemen's Houthi rebels have an array of these killer drone systems. The ADF has none. Michael, this is embarrassing when the Houthi rebels have more advanced technology than Australia.
Look, it is embarrassing. We just saw an unmanned drone kill 3 Americans in Jordan yesterday. Drones are the weapons of the future. They carry bombs and often they can't be detected if they fly extremely low to the ground. So what we've got is a brilliant army who distinguished themselves in Iraq and Afghanistan, our soldiers. But in terms of the nuff-nuffs that sit in Army headquarters in Canberra, we've got a lot of tanks, which we haven't used in battle. I think I heard Greg Sheridan say since the Vietnam War, which was, I think, a while ago, the Vietnam War. We have some surveillance drones, but we have no drones that have missiles, bombs or any weaponry. And this is not serious. I mean, we couldn't send a ship to the Middle East to support the Americans and the British against the Houthis.
Such an embarrassment.
I mean, well, it's an embarrassment, Sharri. I mean, look, we're becoming a laughing stock. And just think of those Australian men and women, right, who've gone into battle and their families in Iraq, Afghanistan and other peacekeeping places, but particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, where Australian lives were lost and their families are sort of obviously still grieving. They must look at the state of the Australian weaponry and think, are these people in Canberra serious? So the fact that we've got no drones that can carry out bombing missions, missile missions, is, as you say, a huge embarrassment to Australia. And what are the Americans and the British and everyone else looking at Australia? They're thinking, that mob down there a joke. I mean, seriously, tanks, for goodness sake.
Yeah. Foreign policy experts are warning that this is the most volatile and dangerous time since World War II, and we're just so behind despite the threat of China, not to mention everything else being right on our doorstep. Now, let's go to some breaking news this evening. A senior advisor to the Prime Minister has been moved out of the PM's office after he attended a Nikki Haley rally. This advisor, Zach Drury, senior advisor, he took a selfie with the Republican candidate. He wore an I Pick Nikki badge. This is just earlier this month. And the Australian now reporting that he's been moved out of Albanese's office into the Finance Minister Katie Gallagher's office. James, this seems very petty to demote someone because they dared to support a Republican candidate.
Well, yeah, I mean, they weren't even supporting a Republican candidate here. This was an act of political tourism, right? Okay? They're young guys. This guy was a young guy. interested, fascinated with politics. He's in America. There's a Nikki Haley rally going on. Of course he's going to go. And of course he's going to, get involved with it and just, have a bit of fun with it. It's not like he's out there campaigning for the Republican. And that's also, even to say that Nikki Haley is hardly the most sort of right-wing, candidate out there for the Republicans, not by a long shot. So this just seems, as you say, incredibly petty. This was a bit of political tourism by a young person. And you know what? I'm sorry. Young people, anybody who's out and there's an election going on, have a look at it. See what's going on. See how other countries do this sort of thing. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, you know what? Albanese could learn a thing or two from Nikki Haley, seeing as she is the last one standing. She might not quite be giving Trump a run for his money, but she is doing much better than Albanese is on the campaign trail, that's for sure. Just before we go, Michael, look, it's been interesting that so far, no question Trump is doing extraordinarily well. He's on track to win the Republican nomination. But we haven't seen Melania or his daughter on the campaign trail yet. The left media are now claiming that he's got a woman problem. They point to this recent case with E. Jean Carroll. Trump has been ordered to pay her $83 million US in damages, even though there's basically no evidence at all. It's just relying on her memory. I mean, surely he's not going to have to pay such an extraordinary amount. Do you think he's going to win on appeal here?
I don't know, but the bigger point, Sharri, is this. The public in America doesn't care. They're voting for what Trump represents as much as they're voting for Trump. If it was just Trump, many people wouldn't vote for him. But it's what he represents. It's an anti-woke America. It's a proud America. It's a strong America. It's America that stands by its allies like Israel and Britain. It's an America that wants to be energy self-sufficient. It's an America where he wants the elites to move on and, as he said, drain the swamp. Well, he didn't even get near the bottom of that swamp. Where he wants secure borders, where he wants police in cities to regulate law and order. He doesn't want 4 or 5 million people coming across the border, going into the American welfare system. It's what Trump represents. It's the outsider trying to drain the swamp. The brand of Trump is much bigger than any of these other things. I mean, anyone who was on 91 serious charges, in Australia would get 2% of the vote. But in America, people understand these legal actions against him are very politicised. The courts are very politicised against Trump. Most judges are elected in the lower courts. So it's brand Trump that can batter away any of these minor issues. They just hit him and they just bounce off. So do I think the court case, defamation case matters? No.
Not just bounce off, he turns them and they work in his favour. But James, this immigration scandal in the United States under the Biden administration is also really helping Republicans.
Yeah, well, I mean, what's going on there is just unbelievable, Sharri. Since Joe Biden took office, 10 million people have made unauthorized crossings into the United States. 10 million. And now, they're winding up in all of these Democrat sanctuary cities that said, #welcome and no human is illegal. And now, of course, they're, sleeping in their airports and their police stations, and they're causing all sorts of trouble for their budgets and their schools and everything else. And it's a real rolling humanitarian disaster here. And it's just shocking here that the Biden administration is now, one thing that people should be aware of, they're trying to push this sort of nonsense bill in the Senate that says, we'll allow a certain number of people in, but then we'll shut down the border if we get too many on a certain period of time. They have the power to shut down the border. They're not doing it because they don't want to, and they want to get as many people into the country as they can with an eye towards an eventual amnesty program. That is what the Democrats are doing. The American people are sick of it.
Yeah, it seems like this is one of the number one issues that's going to emerge this year. Michael Kroger, James Murray, thank you both so much.
Thanks.
Now let's turn to this horror shark attack in Sydney Harbour last night. It nearly claimed the life of a young woman. Lauren O'Neill, she's just 29 years old. She's likely going to lose part of her right leg after she was bitten, we now know, by a bull shark in Elizabeth Bay in Sydney's east. Now, this is the first shark attack in Sydney Harbour since 2009, when, you'll recall, Navy diver Paul de Gelder was mauled. The response today from the green environmentalist lobby was utterly predictable.
We need to focus at these times on what we can do best to reduce the risk of shark bite. And we do know that the harbour is an area of high shark activity. There has been bites there in the past. We need to make that education more readily available, that the swimming at night in the harbour is just not a great idea.
Journalist Fred Paul has been warning about the threat that shark attacks pose for years, and he joins me now. Fred, thank you so much for your time. Look, tell us what the figures show about whether or not we are seeing more shark attacks.
Oh, the figures are absolutely comprehensive, Sharri, and thanks for having me on. The sort of the attention that these things get is starting to dwindle because attacks are starting to become normalised, and we are starting to be conditioned to accept that the waters are more dangerous than ever. But I mean, just one simple statistic, if you like, the number of fatalities around Australia in the past 10 years has been 26. They're the 26 that we know of. There's been probably half a dozen disappearances of people at beaches that can't be categorically described as shark fatalities, but almost certainly were. So in the past 10 years, 26 fatalities that we know of, maybe more. The previous 10 years, Sharri, there were 8. And this is all a consequence of the increasing obsession of our departments of primary industries, Department of the Environment, all these bureaucrats which have sort of coalesced into an industry, are being obsessed with protecting sharks at the expense of humans. And just one other point about the stats, talk to any surfer, fisherman or diver, and they will tell you absolutely sightings, near misses, attacks, fish being taken off lines, attacking boats, attacking people. All these are through the roof, and the people whose careers depend on us, feeling that there's nothing wrong with sharks and they need to be protected. All of those people are saying, no, we can't tell you how many numbers of sharks there are in the water because it's all anecdotal.
So you're saying that it's not the shark population that's increased, but the measures to reduce attacks. For example, we know that shark nets work, but there now seems to be this movement to either remove them or stop putting them into beaches.
Well, that's true. I mean, it's undeniable, in my opinion, that shark numbers are increasing. The primary objective of the Great White Recovery Plan introduced in 2002, the primary objective was to increase the population of great whites in Australia, and it created this kind of shark industry where bull sharks and tiger sharks and all the other man-eaters were also sort of mollycoddled and protected in various ways. But as for protection, Sharri, that's the other thing. This is where the sort of rubber hits the road. The shark industry would love for us to remove the proven effective ways of protecting humans at popular beaches. In Queensland, sharks, nets and drumlines were introduced in Queensland in 1962, and in Sydney they were introduced in the early 1930s. And in that time, there have been 2 fatalities in each state at a protected beach, despite there being dozens and dozens of fatal attacks at unprotected beaches. So it is clear that the methods that we have been using for a long time are effective. But the problem this has with the greenies, Sharri, is that those methods are lethal. They kill sharks in an attempt to protect people. But according to the environmental lobby, a shark's life is just as valuable as a human's, and you can't go killing sharks just to protect humans anymore.
Look, it's a big wake-up call for Sydney swimmers, that's for sure. I'm sure a lot of people, especially families, are going to be looking for beaches that have the shark nets. Fred Paul, thank you so much for your reporting. Now, coming up, a neo-Nazi leader is unmasked. We'll look at his extraordinary double life and speak to an expert about why these people need to keep their identities hidden. Plus, new data shows shoppers are cutting back on household essentials as the cost of living crisis bites. I'll bring you those alarming figures next. Welcome back. Well, now to some extraordinary inside detail about the neo-Nazi group that's trying to terrorise Sydney and Melbourne. One of the ringleaders of a group that's made headlines this Australia Day long weekend has today been unmasked. There's so much that's normal about Jack Eltis. He's the man on the right of this picture. According to the Sydney Morning Herald, he's in his 20s. He's a father to a toddler. He's a tradie. He's got his own business. But then he reportedly spent his holidays reading Adolf Hitler's manifesto, and the Herald also reports that every month he meets fellow members of the European Australian movement in a Sydney park to train. They do strength, mixed martial arts, and they wave an inverted swastika flag. Eltis wrote on social media that police officers knocked on his door at 7 a.m. last April to revoke his firearms licence and to confiscate 2 rifles, a shotgun and 2 handguns. It's frightening that someone who supports such extremist ideology would have had access to so many weapons. Some of the neo-Nazis who disrupted Australia Day had come to Sydney from Victoria, one of them, Thomas Sewell. This is now a national movement, and the extremists say that they're actively recruiting. One of the leaders reportedly claimed that the weekend of activities, where the group was shut down 3 times by police, well, they say it was a massive propaganda triumph. Being anonymous is essential for these masked men. If any of their businesses where they worked, their employers, found out that they were involved in a neo-Nazi group, you'd think they'd lose their jobs. And that's why the remarks by New South Wales Premier Chris Minns that these neo-Nazis should be named and shamed was so promising. Depriving them of their anonymity would expose their hatred and unravel their lives. But it seems the tough attitude from the Premier isn't backed up by his police force, because there's no plan for their names and faces to be splashed on the front page of the paper. The only way they'd be identified is if police charge these individuals and they go through the court process. But police haven't charged any at this point, despite the un-Australian scenes we saw on the weekend with men in black masks gathering in public parks where children and families were trying to celebrate the long weekend. Not one neo-Nazi charged. Not one hate preacher charged, despite inciting violence like this.
Towards the end of times when the Muslims will be fighting the Jews, the trees will speak, the stone will speak, and they'll say, "O Muslim, O believer, there is a Yahudi behind me, come and kill him."
And not one Opera House protester charged. Apparently it's fine to burn the Australian flag on the steps of our most iconic building and chant, "Gas and kill the Jews." There are tougher penalties if you get a speeding fine or if you don't pay your parking tickets in our major cities, or if you dared not to wear a face mask or sit on a park bench during COVID. I looked at the data today, and police in New South Wales issued 37,000 breaches of public health orders in just 2 months in the lockdown of 2021. 37,000. But when it comes to potentially violent extremist groups, well, they seem to have gone soft. Between the neo-Nazis and the pro-Palestinian protesters, extremist minority groups are threatening our way of life and our social cohesion. And while political leaders may talk tough, nothing is actually done to act as a deterrent. Instead, with all this publicity, these neo-Nazi groups have just had a massive recruitment campaign. They're celebrating the success of their weekend without a charge or criminal conviction among them. And still, apart from the one exposed by the Herald, they're still enjoying their anonymity. The police bizarrely protecting them, despite the Premier clearly saying they should be unmasked. Well, joining me now to discuss this is Dr. Josh Roos. He's a political sociologist and associate professor at Deakin University. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Look, these neo-Nazis are masked. What sort of jobs do they do so that anonymity is so important to them that they go around wearing these thick black masks?
Yeah, great question. There's a limited amount of information available about precisely what these individuals do for a living. We know, for example, that some are self-employed and work in the trades or on building sites, construction. We also know that some work in security, obviously a critical interface with the wider public where they don't want their faces and names associated with Nazism. But then obviously also there are potentially white-collar workers, students. We just don't know. And obviously it's critical that we can identify them because what they're doing is using these masks in much the same way that the KKK in the United States historically used masks, to inspire fear, to sow hatred.
Now, we read in the Herald today that one of these figures that I've just mentioned spent his summer holidays reading Hitler's manifesto. Well, you know, what does this group actually stand for?
First and foremost, the group stands for a white nationalist Australia. So all the logical policies that flow from that, they're extremely anti-Semitic, they're anti the Jewish community, they're anti the Muslim community, they are anti people of colour and talk openly about mass deportations. They're also against gay and lesbian and queer communities. They also believe that women belong back in the home, supporting them as breadwinners. So most of these views in a modern Australia are highly contentious and basically rejected by the vast majority of Australians.
I mean, we're seeing in the past few months this extremism emerge on our streets. I mean, it seems quite brazen, and we're seeing it on the far left and the far right. And, you know, I'm talking about the hate preachers who are inciting jihad. You know, why do you think we are seeing this rise of extremism in Australia at the moment? And also the brazen nature of it. You know, are our authorities not doing enough?
Yeah, so this extremism's been around for about a decade. We've really seen it emerge in the context of economic challenges over the last 10 years, but in particular in the post-COVID environment. People were spending hours and hours at home scrolling and doom scrolling through social media, picking and choosing little bits of information, conducting their own research, and basically pulling these different ideas together. And extremist movements were very, very active during that period of time, attempting to grow their base and to spread their messages. So one key element of this problem is not only the cost of living crisis, the economic challenges that we're facing as a country, which historically link to an emergence and increase in extremism, but continued failure to regulate social media.
I mean, that's so interesting because that's what we saw ahead of World War II, you know, ahead of the rise of Nazism. A lot of the economic challenges there were blamed on the Jews. So, you know, you're saying this cost of living crisis, these inflation pressures are driving the rise of extremism.
Yeah, they are. They're playing a key role because people out there in the wider community are not only emerging from the trauma of 2 years of intense hardship, in particular those locked down at home and couldn't work, and those who felt isolated and alone and obviously disempowered. And so in that context, as we emerge not only from an economic crisis associated with that, but a deep-seated trauma and a sense of anger and resentment that is out there in pockets in particular of the wider community, these groups are seeking to mobilise that. They're seeking to target that anger and to position themselves as effectively the figureheads of a movement that's going to reshape Australia. And that's obviously pretty dangerous and does have strong historic parallels.
I mean, one of the good things about Elon Musk taking over Twitter has been that all those shadow bans, you know, the people on conservative side of politics, innocent people who were shadow banned, that's all been lifted. But of course, the dangerous thing is that a lot of these people that we're talking about, these extremists, now have, you know, free reign on platforms like Twitter. Dr. Josh Roos, thank you so much for your time and those insights. It was really fascinating. Now, coming up, why the Dunkley by-election will be critical if Albanese is to fend off threats to his own leadership, and Qantas poaches a former Virgin executive from right under Optus's nose. More on that next. Welcome back. Well, Peter Dutton won't rush into a decision on whether to support Labor's new version of the Stage 3 tax cuts. He wants to let Albanese suffer for longer in the wake of his broken promise to the electorate. Dutton took his time coming to a position on The Voice, and now he's going to do the same thing on these tax cuts.
I wasn't planning on making an announcement this week in any case. So we've got a lot of work that we've done just to look at the forward estimates numbers, the medium term and into the out years as well.
But the Albanese government is trying to turn the tables on the opposition, and Treasurer Jim Chalmers says the coalition should get out of the way on the tax relief package.
Unfortunately, we got a bit of a glimpse of the Liberals and Nationals in the documentary that was aired on the ABC last night. The Liberals and Nationals are still led by a divisive leader, and they are still a divided coalition.
And so there you go, the political game heats up for 2024. Let's bring in now the Fin Review's Deputy Editor, Kyla Lusukian. So good to see you. And the Chief Economic Advisor at Judo Bank, Warren Hogan. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Warren, I want to start with you. I mean, we're all talking on Sky News and political commentators about the broken promise, Albanese's breach of trust with the electorate. But a lot of economists are saying that the fact that the government's changed Stage 3 tax cuts, this is also now a missed opportunity for tax reform. What do you think about that?
Well, it's reversing reform, because the Stage 3 tax cuts were really the reform element of the overall three-stage package put forward in 2019. So it's actually going backwards on a reform agenda for short-term economic and political objectives, really.
I mean, one of the attractive parts about the Stage 3 tax cuts, Kyla, was that it created this synthesised 30% tax bracket across company tax and personal income tax. People didn't, have to shuffle their money and their taxes. It's a much easier system. That's now lost.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I guess what some of the commentators who we were talking to were saying that, people might look for tax minimisation methods, that type of thing, that weren't going to do that, they weren't going to need to do that, and now they might be doing that. But I mean, I think overall, you'd say that a lot of the Fins readers would probably think that, we need philosophically to do this type of thing to actually, stop the bracket creep, and this was a way of doing it. I mean, you remember we were both reporting on politics at the time when Turnbull brought this in,
yeah.
And it was part of a package. It was like Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3, and so this was. It wasn't kind of like this thing that was done kind of in and of itself. It was done as part of this thing. So I think it would have been good to get to the end of that process. Perhaps if Labor had some views about what tax should look like, what tax policy should look like, they could have perhaps, enunciated it, taken to an election, for instance, that type of thing. But, they said they were going to do this and it was part of a package. I think they should have done it.
Yeah. I mean, bracket creep is something we've been speaking about a lot in this show. Tax increases by stealth. Australia has a disproportionately high reliance on direct taxes, on personal income taxes, compared to other countries with a AAA credit rating. And Middle Australia shares the burden of this. The last time there was changes to the tax thresholds was 2008. Really, if that had... if the changes had been aligned, the top tax bracket would be kicking in for those earning $250,000 right now, not $190,000 or $180,000.
Yeah, and indeed, if we went to be in line with some other countries around the world, it would be maybe $350,000 or something like that. Of course, that would have implications for other income levels. But to your point, bracket creep is out of control in this country in the last 2 years. It's a silent tax, and in a low inflation world of the last 30 years, the general public and the politicians have managed it. But it is stark how much it's increased. To give you an idea, income tax paid by households in the 3 months to September last year was $91 billion. In 2 years prior, in 2021, in that same 3-month period, it was $65 billion. It's gone up. It's massive.
Massive.
So bracket creep's always there.
That's why Labor's budget position as well is in such good shape.
Yeah, and look, this is never discussed, but the real issue is the other side of the ledger. Do we need to reduce the size of government, because we're rapidly getting our government back to the size it was in the 1970s, and that was not a great decade for the economy. So we're not actually dealing with the real issue, which is is the size of government right? And of course, tax cuts are an important way to help start to reduce it, but we have to reduce our reliance on income taxes. There's no two way about it.
I mean, Kyle, at this point, it just seems like tax reform is in the too hard basket. Even if Peter Dutton does, and he'll probably have to support these tax cuts. He can't go to an election arguing that vulnerable Australians don't deserve more tax relief, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, well, it's very hard to make that point, and particularly these tax cuts will help. I think the number was 11 million people, and they will disadvantage, relatively speaking, 1.3 million people who would have got more tax. So it's going to be a very hard position for him to argue against that. But yeah, like I said earlier, I think what it does is put back this kind of cohesive kind of tax policy making, and instead it's kind of, we'll just do this because maybe there's a by-election on, or there's some other ad hoc issue that we need to address right now before we get to like what tax policy should look like.
Short-term politics.
That's right.
Instead of actual proper tax reform. Now, let's have a look at the retail sales. They took a steep dive in December as shoppers cut back on household goods, clothes and footwear. This is even in the run-up to Christmas. It shows how much the cost of living crisis was biting. Warren, this is said to be the steepest decline since the pandemic.
Yeah, we've got to be careful because of the shift in consumer spending towards the Black Friday, Cyber Monday. The Australian Bureau of Statistics, which adjusts for different seasons and different events each month, is struggling to deal with that. So we had a big jump in November, which was revised down. Then we've got this fall now. Then what's going to happen in January? So we've got to look through this. So just a word of warning on the data there. But this is to be expected. Rates have gone up a lot. Consumer spending was relatively strong in the pandemic, and the consumer is bearing the brunt of not just higher rates, higher income tax burden, and obviously the cost of living. So I actually think this is going to get worse before it gets better, and there shouldn't be any surprises here. It's not collapsing at 2.7% a month. That was just the monthly figure, but we are in a declining trend for spending, and that's going to put pressure on many retailers.
Yeah, and look, the point is that the high immigration, the 500,000 people a year, is definitely holding up the economy, whereas a lot of economists point out, and I'll come back to you on this, Warren, but Kyle, a lot of economists point out that we are in a per capita recession, and that's why it feels so tough for people. That's reflected in the retail figures.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that there's a cost of living crunch on for quite a lot of Australia. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I guess it's what, and what the impact of that is on businesses, on retailers. I mean, I don't think this is directly correlated, but obviously you saw Godfrey's, fall into a hole. There's going to be company reporting season coming up starting next week. So I think we will have an opportunity now to see what spending and consumer sentiment is doing for businesses and for their profits.
Inflation data meant to be out tomorrow. Both of you, economic experts, any predictions on what we're going to see?
Look, the group of economists out there are usually pretty good, so I think we're going to see a moderate increase. It's still high, 0.8% in the quarter, but the annual rate will come down to around 4.25%, 4.5%. So it's all going to move in the right direction, but the devil is in the detail. And we've got to look at the domestic services inflation. None of that was in the monthly, not a lot of it's in the monthly indicator, which we had for October and November. So we will get more insight into the trajectory of domestic inflation. And that, of course, is what the RBA is looking at. It isn't coming down anywhere near as quickly as the overall inflation. And of course, I don't think this inflation battle is won just yet. We may not need more rate hikes, but I think tomorrow will be a bit of a wake-up call that rate cuts are a long way off.
Quickly, what's your view on why our inflation levels are falling more slowly than other places in the world, the US, UK?
Yeah, well, we're lagging those countries, so that's just a matter of timing. But also, our industrial relations system is rigid, and it was slow for wages to start picking up. They've only just started to, and every business I talk to says it's wage and non-wage, i.e. industrial relations related costs that are really keeping on pushing up. So what worries me is that business costs are not abating, and that's going to make it hard for inflation to fall significantly or to the extent the RBA wants over the course of this year.
Yeah. Also, Kyla, quickly before we go, tell us about Qantas's new corporate affairs chief, who they've poached.
Well, I think Qantas is in the middle of an almighty repair job, so they need someone...
Thanks to you guys at the Fin Review.
I mean, I'd say thanks to Qantas's service record.
Of course, I'm just
so they've got a new person in to do the kind of the corporate spin, and they've also got McKinsey in to tell them how to make the planes run on time. So hopefully, good luck to them.
Yeah, all right. Kyla Lasuki and Warren Hogan, thank you both so much.
Thanks.
Now, after the break, the Coalition meets tonight to discuss their next move on the tax cuts. Anne Webster will join us live to give us the breaking details. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, as we've been discussing, the Coalition now need to decide whether or not to support Anthony Albanese's version of the Stage 3 tax cuts. And Nationals politician Anne Webster is here to tell us what she thinks needs to happen in the Coalition. Welcome to the program. Now, do you think the Coalition should be supporting Labor's version, even though it's a broken promise?
Look, I think what we need to focus on, Sharri, thank you for having me, is that this is a broken promise and this is Albanese's disaster to fix. The Coalition had a 5-year reform plan for tax, which was bipartisan until last week. And so our move forward, of course, is to have party room meetings and to discuss all of the possibilities in a time where our electorate suffering with cost of living. This is not a solution to offer people in my electorate. The majority will have about a $15 a week bonus from July 1 in their pay packet. That's not cost of living relief. Albanese has literally derailed the train of reform, tax reform, for very little gain, all to win Dunkley election.
So if you're saying that the Albanese government's reform of $15 or $18 a week isn't enough, do you think there needs to be a more generous cost of living package?
I think what we've got to do is acknowledge that real wages have actually fallen around $153 a week, and what has fed into that are things like energy costs, grocery bills, petrol prices. There is a range that has been in the Prime Minister's bailiwick to deal with, and he has not dealt with it. And now the people across Australia, particularly middle and lower income earners, are the ones who are suffering, and he is the one who needs to sort this out. And I don't think that his solution of $15 a week from July 1, it's not going to do anything for anybody until then, is a solution at all.
Even though it's not enough, are you going to argue that the Coalition should back it?
Well, I'll be talking in the party room, of course, presenting the numbers, the stats in my electorate, which I've gathered and have been looking at. I am really concerned that this actual change by the Prime Minister will not bring the kind of relief that people are looking for anyway. So that's a bigger conversation, and that's a different conversation to what we're actually looking at in terms of supporting this change or not. And we've got a big party room, the Coalition party room. The Nats will be discussing first, and the Liberals will be discussing, and then we'll come together and we will reach a position, and we'll be bringing that, obviously, to the Australian people.
And what's your personal view?
Well, my personal view is I am incredibly sympathetic to people who are doing it tough. I am deeply concerned that this particular measure is not going to meet the needs, and I'm very concerned that the Prime Minister has done very little to deal with the driving factors that have led to this disaster.
I mean, the other proposition is that if the Coalition doesn't support Labor, doesn't pass this legislation, Labor will start negotiations with the Greens. And, you know, who knows how the package will look at the end of that.
Well, absolutely, but it is completely and utterly on the Prime Minister's head and on the Labor government for bringing Australia to its knees in the way that it has.
All right, Anne Webster, Nationals MP, thank you so much for your time. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned. Right now, the great Paul Murray is up.